I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. You know, as a devout fan of horror movies, I realize I'm a walking contradiction. For each one of my so-called opinions about horror, it doesn't take long for a movie to appear that makes me contradict myself. Like, take my long-held opinion that I dislike horror movie sequels. In general, I think sequels damage the original film because they complicate simple stories and they bleed a good idea dry. But then you get a movie like William Peter Blatty's Exorcist III, and I praise that sequel on the show, and someone calls me on it. And that is fair play, because Exorcist III does a lot of the things I hate about sequels. It has a complicated backstory with one too many characters. It doesn't bring back Regan and her mother. Those are the characters you cared about, and instead they bring back supporting characters. And the movie inevitably repeats the climactic finale of the original film. When the priest in Exorcist III enters to perform the rites of exorcism, his entrance is shot like the entrance of a pro wrestler. Hey, it's a crowd pleaser. And all of that stuff is true about The Exorcist III. And yet, Exorcist III is such a bizarre and dark and just plain insane movie that I absolutely love it. It is batshit crazy. What's so batshit crazy about Exorcist III? Well, first off, it's just all over the place. The movie's a bizarre mix of police procedural and a very supernatural horror film. On one hand, your main characters are a detective and a priest, and both are senior citizens, so there's a lot of talking instead of doing. And there's weird attempts at humor where people talk with a lot of snappy one-liners, and they really fall flat. Some of the performances, especially the head of a mental hospital, are on the verge of comedic. But when it gets surreal, statues of Jesus on the cross bleed, and their sculpted eyes open in horror. Demonic voices carry in the wind. People crawl on the ceiling, and dead people may or may not be revived by a demon within them. And then there's a killer who murders people in such a meticulous and cruel fashion, it feels only a force of true evil could perform them. And then, just to add to the head-scratching, there are dream sequences that aren't scary as much as they are eccentric and peculiar. Like there's a huge ballroom full of angels. Some walk around while others try to talk to the living using shortwave radios. All of this happens while an orchestra made up of angels plays big band tunes. The Exorcist III is absolutely 100% crazy. But it's a crazy that just happens to work because it is so out there. It is just as crazy as the mind of the late William Peter Blatty, who wrote and directed the film. All of his idiosyncrasies, his love for old comedies and old musicals, and his time with the Jesuits, it pours unfiltered into this movie. And it has some of the best scares I've ever seen in a horror film. See, Blatty had a knack for portraying evil that very few directors ever attain, and I think it's because he was a true believer. Some movies are so unpredictable, so over the top, or are so defiant of normal story logic that they create their own subgenre. I call that subgenre the batshit crazy horror film. Now, when I talk about batshit crazy horror movies, I don't mean movies that are incompetent. A batshit crazy movie is one where, while you're watching it, you're having a hard time believing what you're seeing. It's not good or bad. It's just impossible to stop watching. It's like hypnosis or a bad car crash or watching a trapeze artist wobble on the tightrope while her costume starts to fall off. The batshit crazy horror movie sticks to its own unique and strange wavelength for better or for worse. These movies are wildly unique, and you get the feeling only the maniacs who made them could make them. The first batshit crazy film I want to talk about surprised the hell out of me, because before I watched it, I would never have thought in a million years that I'd be talking about it. As you probably know, I'm not a fan of slasher films. I know I'm in the minority here when it comes to slashers. Honestly, I think most of them are lazy horror movies that follow a very boring template and they rarely even try to scare the audience. So of course, the first Batshit Crazy movie on my list is a slasher film. Not only did this movie have to overcome the hurdle of being a slasher film to make my list, but it's also a certain type of slasher film. It's a killer clown slasher film. God save me from another killer clown slasher film. There are almost as many of those as there are zombies. So, considering my distaste for slasher films and the oversaturation of killer clowns, how in the hell did the movie Terrifier make my list? Because Terrifier is absolutely batshit crazy. It simultaneously follows the conventions of a slasher film and then promptly breaks all the so-called rules of the subgenre. And it does this in a really interesting way. Terrifier does this by committing 100% to being everything most slasher films in the 1980s only pretended to be. This is a mean-spirited and trashy and transgressive and thoroughly exploitative horror film that doesn't know when enough is enough. And I say that with the utmost respect. See, what killed the slasher film, and it happened early in the cycle, by the way, was that it had found a formula that catered to audience expectations. So it can be really gory and everything, but if you can predict who is going to die, and you can see how they're going to die, then it's not really that shocking. But the first slashers, the ones made in 1980 and 1981, they were like punk rock. They could give a shit about the rules. Movies like The Prowler and Maniac and My Bloody Valentine resembled grindhouse movies way more than they did Friday the 13th. Those are the ones I like, by the way, in case you thought I was being esoteric in my distaste for slashers. Those movies were meaner, and they were grimier, and they were more deviant than what came before or after them, and that made them uniquely shocking and uniquely real in a strange way. They were unpredictable in the way that an insane person is unpredictable. Terrifier harkens back to that grindhouse vibe of transgression. Nobody in this movie deserves what happens to them. Forget about the final girl, and forget about promiscuous sex gets you killed, and forget about this is revenge for a past tragedy. This is about an evil thing that kills just because it can. On Halloween night, a maniac dressed like a clown massacres a bunch of unsuspecting people in and around a condemned apartment building. The story couldn't be simpler if you tried, and yet the movie keeps us disoriented by not giving us any information to ground us. In fact, Terrifier's blatant disregard for establishing time or place or character gives it an unnatural feel that works in its favor. Terrifier throws us off balance from the first scene, which plays over the fuzzy screen of an old portable television set from the 1980s. A talk show informs us that this is the 1-year anniversary of a massacre at the hands of a killer known only as Art the Clown. What decade is this? We don't know. The host interviews the sole survivor of the massacre, a woman who is scarred beyond recognition. Her nose is gone. Her eyes are missing. Her upper lip is gone. And then, while the opening credits of Terrifier roll, right before the movie title appears, there is this insane violence that comes out of left field. It comes out of left field because the movie had been setting up a different scenario, one that slasher films normally use, something ad nauseum. We expect the traditional horror beats, so we are shocked when a character defies convention without any logical motivation. It feels like that character just threw the script away and went rogue, and it's very effective. Things get more disorienting when the movie cuts from that batshit crazy moment and drops us into a dark street without any explanation. This new scene seems completely unrelated to the carnage we just watched. We are left to not only figure out where we are and who these people in front of us are, we need to figure out if we are in the past or in the present. This movie is just happening right in front of you, and it could care less if you keep up. It should just be a holy mess of incompetent filmmaking, and yet it is so weird and wild and vicious that you can't help but stare. We finally see Art the Clown. It's a guy dressed in a black and white costume. He's strangely fascinating in the way The Shape was fascinating in John Carpenter's Halloween. We know nothing about him, And he's like negative space we project all the personality and anxiety onto because his blankness unnerves us. He doesn't really act like a clown. He sits and stares at people with a slack jaw, and he carries around a garbage bag. What's in it is disturbing, but he's carrying around a garbage bag. Part of me feels that if it weren't Halloween night, Art the Clown would just be Art, the weird guy who snapped one night. And what transpires is a series of insanely brutal and grisly murders that shock because of their total lack of restraint and their total lack of motive or rationale. If you find slasher films morally reprehensible, Terrifier will disgust and enrage you. There is one murder in particular that involves a hacksaw that will live in gorehound infamy. But it's not just the gore that makes Terrifier so shocking. It's a total commitment to a layer of grime and sleaze that you feel in every set piece. And the level of nihilism in the film is pungent because there's an offhand ease of the sadism of Art the Clown. There are moments where Art acts like the dull, robotic slasher killer we've seen a million times. But then he goes beyond that, into an anger and a glee that makes him do more than kill. He destroys. Some special effects here are poor, and there are amateurish performances, but they only make Terrifier feel more like a real grindhouse film. And real grindhouse films have a visceral impact. They're disturbing. They're not really like inside of society. Now, I remember when Terrifier was released, and a big-name horror website reviewed it with a little bit of anger. They loved the crazy gore, sure, but there was a moment in the film when the killer breaks a cardinal rule of the slasher film. It has to do with the choice of a weapon, believe it or not. The reviewer blustered about how Terrifier cheated and how it tarnished the sanctity of the slasher film. It's when you watch a film like Terrifier that you realize just how safe most slasher films really played it and how predictable they really were. Terrifier is batshit crazy. So I think we've all had this experience. We hear a movie plot and we wonder, how in the hell did that idea ever get made? When someone told me the plot of the next movie I'm going to discuss, I assumed they were pulling my leg. And then they showed me a picture of the movie poster to say, no, I'm serious. And I was positive that the movie poster was fake. Well, I'm here to tell you he was right. It is not a fake. And I'm here to tell you it must be seen to be believed. The movie is Rubber. What is Rubber about, you may ask? I am so glad you did. It is a movie about a killer tire. I'll say that again. Rubber is about a killer tire. The round kind that goes on your car. Now, you know what the funniest thing about this whole situation is? You've just heard that the movie is about a killer tire, and now you think you understand the concept. My God, you have no idea what you're in for. Now, I have to try and explain what the experience is like to watch Rubber, and this is as close as I can get. Imagine that the playwrights Harold Pinter and Samuel Beckett decided to make a horror movie together on a drunken dare. They leave the bar to find out that Pinter's car has a flat tire, and when he opens the trunk, he realizes he has no spare. I mean, the story just writes itself. I'm only being slightly facetious here. Like the plays of Beckett and Pinter, Rubber makes you feel like you might be losing your mind while you're watching. Now, while you watch, that's an important phrase. In fact, this is a movie more about us watching a killer tire than it is about the killer tire itself. Kind of like the birthday party and Pinter's play of the same name and Godot and Beckett's play, the killer tire is only part of what's going on. Rubber is absolutely batshit crazy. How batshit crazy is it? Let me describe the opening scene. We are in the desert, and there are a few dozen empty wooden chairs scattered about. There's a man dressed like an accountant standing nearby who holds what looks like a dozen or so pairs of binoculars in his hands. No explanation. a car appears from behind some high chaparral, and it slowly makes its way towards the accountant. The car intentionally steers into every chair and breaks them, like they were flags on a slalom run. When the car finally stops, the trunk pops open, and a highway patrolman in full uniform climbs out of it. He walks to the driver's side, and the driver hands him a glass of water. And then the patrolman walks towards the camera, and he looks directly into it, and he says, "In the Steven Spielberg movie E.T., why is the alien brown? No reason." He then asks why the pianist in Roman Polanski's movie had to live like a bum if he played piano so well. No reason, he says. All great films, without exception, the patrolman says, contain an important element of no reason. And you know why? Because life itself is filled with no reason. Why can't we see the air all around us? Why are we always thinking? Why do some people love sausages and other people hate sausages? No fucking reason. The driver of the car beeps his horn and says, "Come on, don't waste your time explaining that garbage. Let's go." And the patrolman turns to the camera and says, "Ladies, gentlemen, the film you are about to see today is an homage to the no reason, the most powerful element of style." And then he pours the water out into the sand. Welcome to the first 3 minutes of Rubber. Believe it or not, that whole opening sequence is crucial to the plot of Rubber, or the subplot, or the theme, or the meaning of life. I don't know. The action heats up when we are finally introduced to Goodyear, the demonic tire. I looked it up on IMDb, and yes, the character name for the tire is Goodyear, and it is played by Robert. We first see Goodyear half buried in the sand inside of a small dumping ground in the desert. At first, everything is deathly still, and then slowly, the tire begins to stir. It rotates back and forth as if clawing its way out of a grave. Goodyear frees itself from the grave, but when it tries to roll, it falls over, groggy with exertion. After a few tries, the tire gets its balance and slowly rolls away. It stops in front of an empty plastic water bottle. Ominous music swells, and the tire rolls over the bottle with a splintery crunch. This is First Blood. And this small action puts a tale of madness, obsession, and revenge into play that leaves a trail of blood and brains everywhere the tire rolls. Lots of brain matter. Now, before I go any further, ask yourself, on a primal level, how do you think a killer tire goes about killing its victims? I mean, it's obvious, right? The tire has psychokinetic powers and uses them to make people's heads explode. Of course it does. Goodyear uses this power for the first time on a rabbit. Goodyear turns to face the rabbit, and the tire ripples and it vibrates, and the rabbit explodes in a shower of gore. Once the tire gets a taste of blood and carnage, it rolls into a nearby town, and the body count is large. But the tire isn't the only one racking up a body count. Someone else is killing off audience members. What am I talking about? Well, you'll have to watch Rubber to understand what happens, or attempt to understand what happens. Now, technically, this film is very well crafted. The desert cinematography works hard to capture the lonely beauty of movies like The Hitcher and Duel. The filmmakers take great pains to give Goodyear, who may be an inanimate object but seemingly possessed by a dead killer, a human personality. Goodyear moves with purpose and emotion, and it even hides out in a dive motel watching porn and the Indy 500. Shots from the killer's point of view are dead accurate from what you'd see in a horror film, except instead of a killer's shoulder on the edge of the frame, you have a tire's sidewall. In fact, that's where the batshit craziness of this movie pays off with nasty satire. While I was watching Goodyear pull itself out of the sand and stagger around and then slowly regain its power, one small training step at a time, I realized that I had seen this movie before. Well, not Rubber specifically, but I had seen this movie in its many, many different guises. This is the killer who rises from the grave to exact revenge on those that murdered him to steal his treasure. This is the gangster, or the soldier, or the cowboy who is left for dead in a shallow grave and returns to wreak vengeance. This is the bride breaking out of her coffin to go kill Bill. And that's the cosmic joke at the center of Rubber. These tropes are so common that they are invisible to us as viewers. We are so used to cliches that even a tire can act its way through these movies. And then there's a subplot that involves the highway patrolman, a hotel manager, a turkey, a mannequin, and a wheelchair-bound vet. And as hard as it is to believe, the subplot will be the one that makes you question your sanity more than the psychokinetic tire will. This is a hilariously absurd horror film that breaks the fourth wall and uses farce to comment on how Hollywood is devoid of ideas and how little Hollywood thinks of its audience. Oh, and it's also about a killer tire. Rubber is unapologetically and intentionally batshit crazy. Now, the batshit crazy horror movies that I've talked about so far were mad interpretations of relatively standard storylines. But you know what? Sometimes the batshit crazy starts at the source material. Back in 1967, the first horror film made in Soviet Russia was released. It was based on an old Ukrainian folktale. Now, there's a reason that what the source material was is important. Because since the story was considered a folktale, the directors were able to avoid the censorship restrictions that held back a lot of Soviet cinema. The filmmakers took complete advantage of that loophole. The movie is V, spelled V-I-Y, and not to be confused with the 2014 movie with the subtitle The Forbidden Empire. I am talking about the 1967 film V, and accept no substitutes, because V is proudly and gorgeously batshit crazy. It's a burst of mad creativity that Soviet cinema hadn't delivered since the heyday of Sergei Eisenstein's silent films. The movie begins with 3 seminary students on vacation who get lost in the woods. They come upon a farmhouse, and they ask the old woman who lives there if they can stay for the night. She agrees, as long as they sleep in different areas of the farm. It's a strange request, and soon we find out why she asked. The old woman visits one of the young priests, and she tries to seduce him. They struggle, and the old woman puts the priest under a spell where he falls to the ground, stiff as a board. She jumps on his back and rides him like a horse across fields and hills, and then she pulls out a broom and she flies him through the sky. When they get to the ground, they wrestle again, and the priest grabs a stick and beats the old hag. The hag is mortally wounded, and she begins to turn into a beautiful girl. When the priest realizes that the witch is dying, he runs off into the night. But when he gets back to his village, the priest is told by his rector that a rich merchant has requested him by name to stand vigil for his daughter, who is found beaten to death in the woods. Her body is laid in state at the chapel, and the priest is required to be locked in the church, alone with her body, to pray for her soul over 3 long nights. There is a Slavic superstition called midnight dread. It is the belief that evil people automatically become the devil's subjects when they die, and the earth will not hold these demons, and they crawl out of the ground at midnight to torment the living. And these demons also rise to bring the souls of evil people who recently died, even if their bodies are locked in a church. And it's what transpires each night, once the doors are locked, that make this movie batshit crazy. Each night gets crazier than the last one, and demons appear, and the demons get freakier, and they get bolder, and the dead won't stay dead. But The real midnight dread is how the demons, no matter how weird and dangerous they seem, cower in fear at the mention of the name of the demon yet to come. V. V is coming. Now, one of the reasons that this movie feels so unhinged is that it has a very unusual and uncanny look to it. V is a movie that uses every silent film trick in the book. There's obviously no CGI in 1967, so this movie uses practical effects and trick camera work and even amazing puppetry to literally raise hell, to literally defy gravity. Ghosts and evil spirits and demons converge on the young priest who ends up having to pray for his own mortal soul. But the inventiveness of this horror movie raises more than just the ghosts in front of the camera. This movie raises the spirit of one of the most innovative periods in cinema history, the Russian silent movie era. This monster movie snuck past the oppressive control of the Soviet regime and let its artistic freak flag fly. And there's something very comforting about a movie that's over 50 years old that can still feel batshit crazy. Now, there's also a modern kissing cousin to V, another batshit crazy film based on a novel steeped in Estonian folklore and mythology. The movie is November, and it's like a cross between The Witch and Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It has the authentic feel of the wilderness that made The Witch so effective and engrossing. But it also shows the absurdity of living during such a terrible time where you know who the king is because he doesn't have shit all over him. November is the story of a pagan village during the time when Estonia is ruled by German aristocrats and Christianity is making its inroads. The pagans are starving in the shadow of the opulent manors. The movie is about the villagers trying to survive a nasty November. This is a world where the devil lives in a forest at the crossroads and where women transform into wolves to spy on lovers. It's a world where the Black Plague appears as a beautiful woman who kisses men and they turn black and die. It's also a world where you wear your pants on your head to fool the plague into thinking you have two asses and therefore not worth kissing. The movie starts with a striking image of some crazed living automaton crawling through a pasture. It looks like a giant Chinese throwing star with a horse skull at the center, and it is in search of cattle to steal. We find out that this is a krat, a mythological Estonian beast that is made up of hay or old household implements like brooms and pails. A krat is brought to life when the devil puts a soul into it, and its purpose is to do its master's bidding. The master is usually a farmer who strikes a deal with the devil, and its master's bidding is for the krat to steal from other farmers. And if you don't keep a krat busy, it might just kill you in your sleep. This is a horror film where scarcity is the driving force for the living and the dead. And even the supernatural beasts. Scarcity. Everyone is stealing from everyone. The devil gives souls for the krats in exchange for 3 drops of blood from the farmer. But the farmers trick him with black currant juice in order to protect their own souls. Because they know that just doing business with the devil makes their souls potential krat bait after they die. In November, life and even the afterlife is a vicious circle. In the universe of November, all the old folklore is real and tangible. The 1st of November is All Souls Day, and the villagers go into the cemeteries in the forest to meet their departed loved ones. And it is beautiful when the dead, all dressed in white that matches their skin, walk out of the forests for one night. And then they open their mouths, and they haven't changed a bit. Old resentments live on into the afterlife, it seems, and some ghosts won't even set foot in their old house because someone they hate is inside. It's the folklore and mythology becoming real in everyday life that gives November its horrific edge. Because we see the devil at the crossroads. We see the Black Plague hiding in a pig that screams like a human being. We see curses that become real. And we see the Krats, these damned and doomed souls, forever enslaved by the mistakes of their past. The horror of November isn't that life sucks and then you die. The horror is that you die and the afterlife sucks. And that is a batshit crazy moral for a folktale. Recently, I was a guest on the Film Loop podcast. It's a film review show where a Gen Xer and a millennial watch a movie and then they give their generational opinions. The idea is, what movies retain their power over the test of time? I was asked to come on to talk about Dario Argento's mad masterpiece, Suspiria. Suspiria is a visual banquet of horrible, beautiful imagery and sound, and in 1977, there was nothing quite like it. I saw it in about 1984, 1985, and there was nothing quite like it at that point. It was audacious and loud and violent, and it felt like it was made by a madman as much as it felt like it was made by a serious artist. It didn't matter that the story was thin, or that there were weird lapses in logic, or that the dialogue left a bit to be desired. Argento's rich and passionate vision was so strong and unique. Those things were considered minor quibbles. The artist and the passion shone too bright to be denied. However, that was 41 years ago. I wasn't sure how it would fare with a first-time viewer after all the cinematic innovation that's happened over the decades. It would be unrealistic to think it would still be considered cutting edge after all this time. However, not 1 minute into the podcast, the millennial couldn't contain himself. I love this movie. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. And that reminded me of the appeal of batshit crazy films. Real crazy never ages. And with that said, I think there's a bright future ahead for director Panos Cosmatos and his uber batshit crazy horror movie, Mandy. Like Suspiria, Mandy has a thin story, and it has lapses in logic. And like Suspiria, the passionate vision at the center of this movie is just too strong to dismiss. This is unapologetic filmmaking that doesn't care to explain itself to you. You are free to tag along for the ride. Just keep up. The movie starts with an anonymous quote on the screen. "When I die, bury me deep. Lay 2 speakers at my feet. Grab some headphones around my head and rock and roll me when I'm dead." Well, the quote certainly sets a tone, although Mandy is more like a movie with 3 acts, and each one of those acts has a different tone. The story takes place in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest in 1983. In the first act, we meet Red Miller, a lumberjack who shares a small cabin in the woods with his artist girlfriend, Mandy Bloom. She's an ethereal beauty who has 2 different colored eyes and a scar on her cheek. She wears Motley Crue t-shirts, she reads fantasy novels, and she creates fantasy art. They are both damaged people who are slowly healing through the bond they have with each other. Red refuses a drink early on in the film, so we assume he's a recovering alcoholic, and Mandy tells him stories of her abusive and violent father. They calm and soothe and heal each other, and they seem happy in their life of isolation. And then that leads us to the second act. We are introduced to the Children of the Dawn, a roving hippie cult with a crackpot leader named Jeremiah who keeps the cult dosed with LSD. Mandy is walking on the side of a country road on her way to work when the cult passes her in their van, and Jeremiah sees her. Jeremiah is immediately obsessed with her, and he demands that his followers kidnap her and bring her back to him. Doesn't sound too far out yet, does it? Well, I haven't gotten to the biker gang made up of creatures from hell, or the human sacrifices, or the tiger in a cage, or the outrageous violence and the incredible amount of gore and bloodshed. Or that the movie suddenly changes from live action to animation that looks inspired by Heavy Metal magazine. And I have not yet discussed the single most important batshit crazy special effect in the movie, Nicolas Cage. Cage abandons all subtlety and he just dives right into the increasing psychedelic madness of this movie and tops any insanity shown on the screen. If there is insanity on the screen, look up, there's Nick Cage. There's a scene in the movie, and you'll know it when you see it, that the cameraman seems lost at how to film Cage's wildness. Should I dolly in? Should I dolly out? Should I tilt up? I'm not sure what he's going to do. It's like even the set is in awe of just how willing he is to go completely off the rails for performance. And it's weirdly brave, and it's incredibly, amazingly, unfathomably effective. Now, I could describe everything that happens in the movie, and it wouldn't touch the experience of watching it. Like Suspiria and 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's really pointless to try and describe Mandy. When you watch the movie, it becomes obvious that you are watching an act of artistic passion that risks everything for the vision. It becomes obvious that you are watching the work of an artist who is also a madman. And you know what? Maybe that's why I enjoy batshit crazy horror movies as much as I do. So many mainstream horror films follow the same style and the same execution, and they follow it so closely that even the coming attraction trailers are interchangeable at times. But the batshit crazy horror movies, they are the messy upstarts that couldn't blend into the crowd if they tried. They may not be for everyone, and they may be far from perfect, and they may never get critical praise, but they are not boring. They are so out of step with what is popular at the time that they attain a certain timelessness. Because real crazy never ages. Oh yes, it's that time, folks. Now, I've had several people contact me about financially supporting the show. Thank you so much for asking. And I want to say that Hellbent for Horror is a listener-funded show. I don't sell advertising. I don't waste your listening time with ads. Now, with that said, the show does need your help to keep going in the way that it has been. If you like the show and you think you're getting value from it, there are several ways that you can help out. You can tell others about the show, really important. You can write reviews on iTunes, and you can support the show financially by a few different methods. If you want to use a credit card or debit card, you can contribute an amount per episode using Patreon. You can also contribute using PayPal. Both Patreon and PayPal will take a percentage of your payment, and I know some people don't like to use PayPal or Patreon. So H4H is also listed on Zelle. Zelle's a digital transfer service that's an option on most U.S. bank accounts. So you can find me on Zelle by my email address, and that's scott@hellbentforhorror.com. And just list a dollar value you feel is fair. You can also make that a recurring payment by clicking on a button when you fill out your information. If you're not into the whole digital payment thing, H4H has a P.O. box, and you can send checks or money orders or chickens or weird email to this address. Hellbent for Horror, PMB 800-800-1250 Fairmont Drive, Suite A, San Leandro, California, 94578. And if there's a way you wish to support that I haven't listed here, just contact me, and I'll get that service up and running on my website, hellbentforhorror.com. I want to make it easy to support the podcast and keep it going, and I thank you so much for even listening to this. But let's get on to the next thing. Let's go to the listener mailbag. So we have a few emails to cover in this episode. The first email is from Brandon Albert. My first kiss was watching The Exorcist from around the corner of a wall at about 8 years old. It took me a few years to get the guts to watch a full horror movie all the way through, but eventually I was eased into it through Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark, and Tales from the Crypt Keeper, the cartoon version of Tales from the Crypt. A few years later, my friend used to sneak his dad's old EC comics to school, and we'd read them at recess, and I became ravenous. I read Stephen King in grade 7 and trucked through the old slasher flicks and the original Tales from the Crypt. My parents created a monster. Thanks so much, Brandon. And we have another one from someone who just signed on as NA. NA, if you're out there, this is for you. As for my first kiss, I'm afraid I don't know. I cannot remember a time when I wasn't obsessed with monsters, and dinosaurs too by extension. Many of my earliest drawings featured rampaging beasts, so at least I came by it honestly. When I was a wee young'un back in the early 70s, the New York City area stations played loads of old black and white monster movies. I used to comb through the new TV guide when it arrived each week and hunt down every instance. Sometimes they would play the same movie every day for a week. I remember that. So, of course, I would watch it again and again every day. I can recall King Kong, Nosferatu, and the original Phantom of the Opera getting that treatment. There were probably others that I don't recall, but that was over 40 years ago after all. I have never heard anyone state what, for me anyway, was the likely explanation for the attraction. It makes sense to me that kids love monsters because they want to identify with them. Monsters are big, powerful, and nearly unstoppable. They ignore the rules and command fear and respect. Perhaps, most of all, they are not themselves afraid. Monsters have all the things that children lack and very much want. Or maybe that's just me. N.A., thanks so much. That was awesome. And finally, here's an email that came from one of the subscribers to my newsletter. This comes from Jerry Schwartz. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, one of the local stations, WOR-TV out of New York City, used to broadcast $1 Million Movie. If you watched this show, which aired multiple times during the week, you'd see the same film, usually an old cinematic chestnut thriller, romantic comedy, or a monster movie. Some of these, the Godzilla series, King Kong, Mighty Joe Young, Them, Mothra, might not be considered horror films by classicists, but they sure terrified me. I consider them horror films, don't worry. One that could be considered cross-genre into horror, The Crawling Eye, gives me the shakes just thinking about it now. It was the first film that made me understand impending doom. Jerry Schwartz, thanks so much for that email. Now, that last email was from a member of my newsletter for my book, Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. Screaming for Pleasure will be released on November 26, 2018, and I'm kind of in shock and kind of terrified and kind of excited about that. And I wanted to ask you, my audience, for a little help on this. I humbly ask for your help in spreading the word about my book. What I really need is for people who appreciate my work to tell other people about it. And the simplest way to do that is to sign up for my free, non-spammy newsletter and encourage other people who you think would like my work to do the same. You and they will get the first chapter of the book as a free gift just for signing up, and it's a great way for them to try out my style. I need to get outside of my own box, right? And I think that you guys know people out there that are your friends that you talk passionately with. Now, the newsletter comes out every 2 weeks, and I like to give gifts in each one, stuff that's not in the book. And it is super easy to unsubscribe, folks. Newsletter subscription is so important because it lets me talk to people who love horror that I don't know yet. And I need an army of people like you to help me welcome more horror lovers into the great conversation that we've created so far. Will you join the horror horde? The link to my newsletter is on my Hellbent for Horror webpage, my H4H Facebook and Twitter pages as well. Now, people sometimes ask me where they can order the book that best, supports the author. Let me tell you, the best possible way to support the author, pre-order the book. Pre-ordering is the single best way to show support, because when you pre-order, you're letting the retailer know that you're excited about the book, and maybe other people would be excited too. When you pre-order, retailers see one guaranteed sale when the book is released, and that gets their attention. And another reason pre-ordering is important: book sales in the first week of release, they matter to retailers. Pre-ordering means you're guaranteed to be one of those first week sales for them. Early interest and sales help a book's longevity and placement on the shelves. And if that happens, you're more likely to see more books from that author. You can also pre-order the Kindle version in Amazon in the United States, Amazon UK, and Amazon Canada right now. With all of that said, I humbly request that if you're interested in reading my book, that you at least consider pre-ordering it. The book is a love letter to all things that go bump in the night and how horror can be healing as well as thrilling. And I hope you enjoy it. And I thank you so much for continuing to stay hellbent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And in the wings is a Hellbent for Horror book entitled Screaming for Pleasure. I'm currently writing it, and we're shooting for a release in the fall of 2018, so spread the word and keep your eye out. More info on that later. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.